My name is Ron McKay, and I will host today's seminar. Today, Marina Snyder will present on the new postgraduate work permit provisions and new financial requirements for international students. She will be going into more depth on student portals and student strategies and processing in our upcoming August 7th Continuing Professional Development Seminar. Marina?
Hi, thanks, Ron. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Marina. I'm an immigration consultant, and I have the pleasure to be here talking to you about new postgraduate work permit provisions and new financial requirements for international students. I've been RCIC for several years now, and that's one of my specialties, the reason why I'm here talking to you today. So I wanted to start today actually talking about the new financial requirements. The name of the title of this session is Postgraduate Work Permit Provisions and Financial Requirements. I wanted to start the other way around because the financial requirements for a study permit is actually something that can make or break an application. IRCC has released new requirements as of September 1st, 2025. But rather than just talking about the numbers themselves, I wanted to go over the overall explanation and criteria for proof of funds when you submit an application for a study permit. So what IRCC asks of people, that you need to prove that you have enough money without working in Canada to pay for tuition fees for the course or program of studies, living expenses for yourself and the family members who come with you while you're in Canada, and transportation to and from Canada for yourself and your accompanying family members. And I highlighted the word without working because this is something that is very important to consider. Even though you're allowed to work part-time, you shouldn't really be taking into account the amount that you will be earning, that you could potentially be earning if you're working part-time, because you don't really have a guarantee that that will happen. So you really have to show that you have funds for your schooling and for your living expenses and your transportation, as well as yourself and your family without working in Canada. So that's step one. Am I on the right? Yes. So what we see every day is that you don't just have to show this minimum amount of funds. So for sure, IRCC asks for that one minimum amount. So if we go back to the last slide, we're going to do some math, right? And this is all about math. You're going to add your tuition fees, your living expenses, and your transportation. But if you think about this, if you add these numbers, say the tuition fees are 15,000, the living expenses are 20,000, and your transportation is another 1,000, that's the bare minimum that you would have to show. However, what we see in our day-to-day practice applying for study permits is that they're going to look at your overall financial stability, right? So they're going to look at, are the funds that you're presenting legitimate and sustainable sources? So where is this money coming from? You had zero one day, and then the next day you had 100,000 in your bank. Where did this money come from? Is this really your money, or is this really available to you? Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, students arrive in Canada and find themselves in the situation where they can't pay for their school, or they can't cover the expenses for their living expenses, their day-to-day activities, or they have to quit school to be able to work full-time, being non-compliant on their study permit conditions, because they have used money that is not their own to just prove that they have enough funds. They have borrowed money from somebody, or a family member showed that they had funds, but that money was not really available. They were just kind of using that money. So this is very important to understand that when you provide documents to show that you have sufficient funds to cover the cost of your studies in Canada, you need to actually be able to use that money. It can't be some uncle's money that is just giving you documents because it's rich uncle, but he's not actually going to pay for your school. This becomes a real problem for students long, down the road. The applicant also has to show economic ties to their country. So are they using all of the money they have to pay for 1 or 2 years or 3 years or whatever amount of time of their study? So that have they saved, are they using the savings from their entire life for this very short period of time that they're going to spend in Canada? If the answer is yes, you could have a refusal just because it doesn't make sense to an officer evaluating this going, why is this person putting all of their eggs into this one basket? Does this person actually want to study in Canada? Or is this a plan for them to permanently establish themselves in Canada? And they're just using the study route as a port of entry. So we have to have that in mind, that a lot of people, sure, they want to establish themselves in Canada permanently, and they come and they see the study permit as a good option, but you have to be a viable candidate for a study permit, right? So if you don't get the study permit, there's no permanent residence afterwards. This is also a motive that they cite when they're evaluating the strong likelihood of the person leaving Canada at the end of the stay. So whenever you apply for anything that is temporary residence, a study permit, a TRV, which is a visitor visa, a work visa, it doesn't matter what you're applying for. If the nature of that application is temporary, they're going to want to see that you're leaving Canada at the end of your stay. And like I said, if you're putting all of your eggs in one basket, if you're putting all of the money that you have or all your family's resources into this one study program that is not really going to bring any return, any financial return to you when you finish your studies, then you're most likely using this as a pathway to just enter Canada just for any reason, and you don't really want to study. So this is a very common reason for refusal that is related to funds. The refusal may not necessarily say you don't have sufficient funds. It will say you have not convinced that you will leave Canada at the end of the stay. But once you analyze the actual file and the actual reasons for refusal, it has to do with the person's financial capacity. So I usually say there are two important things on a study permit, and one is the topic of studies, and the second one is the proof of funds. So it's not enough to just show the bare minimum. Having said that, what does IRCC accept as proof? So you have to show at least one of the following. Proof that you have paid your tuition and housing fees. So you could have already paid it up front. You might still have to show that you have a little bit left for your food and your transportation and emergencies and things like that. But it's not mandatory for you to have paid it up front, but you could. But paying it up front does not guarantee a study permit approval either. So it's not necessarily what's going to make the application. And not having paid either doesn't necessarily make the application be refused. So you could, if you wanted to, it doesn't guarantee anything, because I have seen applications where a family member had already paid for the tuition and the housing was free, or the person was going to live in the university and it was already paid for. But because the overall financial situation of the person or their economic ties to the country of origin were weak, they were still refused. So they're not going to be refused on the proof of funds. but they will be refused on you have not convinced that you're going to leave at the end of your stay. So other things that you can use are a bank account in Canada. If you've transferred money to Canada, again, it's not mandatory for you to transfer money to Canada. Having a GIC, which is also not mandatory. You could if you wanted to. The way the GICs work for international students are usually that you put a certain amount, just say $10,000, and once you arrive in Canada, they're going to give you an amount, and then every month after that, they're going to give you another amount. So you will have a guarantee, quote unquote, of this specific amount every month that at least you'll be able to cover your minimum living expenses, right? But again, having the GIC is a good thing, but it's not the only element of the application. So it's not absolutely necessary. I have done tons of applications where we did not have a Canadian bank account, we did not have a GIC, we did not have prepaid tuition and housing fees. So you could also use a student loan or education loan from a bank, although again, they're going to look into the overall situation. Why are you getting this massive debt for you to study if your financial situation is not good? And so forth. We do use it. There are some schools that provide financing. But again, it's just one of the elements. Your bank statements for the past month. So that's the best way to actually show that you have money, is to show your bank. I have seen all sorts of bank statements. We could have a bank, like I said, that had 0 and then had 100 the next day. So we have to kind of explain where this money is coming from. I have inherited from someone, or I sold a property, or there was a business deal or whatever. They do want to see it. They do want to see it. And one mistake that a lot of people make is to have bank statements that have lots of transactions. So you have a lot of money going in and a lot of money going out, but your balance is 0. So if you have 100 going in and 100 going out, you don't really have the money, right? So some people think that, oh, but I have a lot of money coming in every month in my bank. But if your balance is 0 or even negative, that's not a good document to include in your application. You could have a bank draft that can be converted to Canadian dollars. Certain countries have restrictions on sending money abroad or exchange of currency. So it depends on which country you are. Are you going to be able to access that bank? So a draft could be an option if that's available in your country. If somebody's covering your fees, then a letter from the person at school giving you money. But like I said, you have to make sure that that money is actually available, because anybody would just write a letter, and then when they get here, they don't really have the funds, and they become destitute students, and they have to stop studying, and it's just a mess, and it kind of breaks their entire plan. Or you could use proof of funding paid from within Canada if you have a scholarship or in a Canadian funded educational program. So that's also very common, especially for I've seen it for bachelor degrees, for masters, for doctorate degrees, especially for doctorate degrees. We see it a lot, but I've seen it for other types of degrees. We don't see so much for college diplomas or certificates, although some colleges sometimes will have some promotions that they're having, and so they're giving kind of an automatic scholarship or an entry merit scholarship, or they're trying to attract students from specific countries, and so they're giving some sort of deal. But you would use that amount also in your math. I like to, when I apply for a study permit, I make a little table on Excel, very accounting-like, where I have my amounts needed and my amounts available, and so that you can have your totals kind of like a financial statement, to be able to summarize all of the funds that are available and all the funds that are going to be needed. And also, if your country uses foreign exchange controls, they must prove that you'll be allowed to export funds for all of your expenses. So this is very common, for example, in Lebanon. That's the only country I can think of, but there are lots of other countries that have currency restriction and even international transfer restrictions. So you have to think of the tools that are available to you in your country of origin. Some people use, they have, for example, an international account with the bank. They're not in the US, but they have a US dollar account in some bank. That's an option too, digital banks or investments and things like that, as long as you're able to access the money and it can be easily transferred. But also have to think that when you apply, that consulate that is processing your application, they're used to dealing with the documents from that country. So they will be able to easily identify what's, a real document and not a real document, and what is what and who is who. Each consulate will have a different dealing. So this is the amounts that were updated as of September 1st, and these are the amounts for the number. So this is for the living expenses, not for the tuition. So you have your tuition, you have your living expenses and your transportation and other costs, medical, insurance, emergency, etc. This is specific for how many people are accompanying you in your project. So if it's just you, you have to show that you have a minimum of 20,635 and so on. So you have this table. This is very black and white. I use it as a minimum amount. So like I said, when I do my little table, I will say tuition fees needed, living expenses needed, transportation is needed. So all the minimum amounts, but it's very not advisable for you to have just the minimum amount when you apply for your study permit. Like I said, this is the living expenses for when you apply for a study permit, considering that this is outside of Quebec. I forgot to mention. So here we have in the province of Quebec. So when students apply for a study permit to come to study in Quebec, you have to apply for a document called the CAQ, Certificate of Acceptation of Quebec. And in that document, you will show the proof of funds that Quebec requests. So these are different amounts. These amounts were not updated as September 1st. These amounts are valid between January 1st and December 31st of 2025. So different from the federal government, Quebec updates the financial tables every year. So this is very common. These numbers that you're seeing here are a jump from a hike from a couple years ago. The numbers had not been updated at all. And then they realized we absolutely need to update these numbers because it used to be something like $10,000 for 1 year of living expenses, which is not enough. So for Quebec, you have to cover your tuition fees, your transportation costs, your living expenses. So same concept you have according to the number of people. You also have what they call the settlement fees for your first year. So this is to cover your winter jacket and your winter boots or your rent deposit or something. And your cost of health or hospital insurance. So if the school is not providing insurance, if it's not included in your tuition, you specifically have to show funds for your health insurance, which is not something that the federal asks. So here's some things to keep in mind regarding funds and study permits. So the financial requirements set by RCIC represent a very minimal threshold and may not accurately reflect the true cost of living, especially in major cities like Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. And I go back to this table, and if you look at this table for a family of four, 38,346, this barely scratches the surface of maybe rent and some food. In some places like Vancouver or Toronto, where rent will be at a minimum $3,000. Even if it's $2,000, $2,500. the people that are arriving in Canada with this minimum amount of money will not be able to sustain themselves. So this is very important to keep in mind, because sometimes people don't really do the math of where they're going. I really want to go to Vancouver. I really want to go to Toronto, and this is the amount of money I need. This money is not, these funds are not realistic. These amounts are not realistic at all. You need to absolutely have a good idea of how much you're going to need. Could a student survive on 20,635? Absolutely. If you're young and single and you're sharing an apartment with 3 other people, which is a lot of the cases, or even if you're living in residence. But when it comes to a family of 4, a family of 5, which is a lot of the times people come with their families, these funds are really not realistic. So you have to do your research. So you have to research the actual cost of living in the city or province where you plan to study and create a realistic financial plan. So we didn't come here to talk about financial planning, but I think this is very important when you do any type of immigration planning, because you have to understand how much do you need, how much do I have, can I get extra income from other sources? What if I have an emergency? What if something happens in my country of origin and I have to fly last minute because a family member is sick or deceased or something? Um, will my finances support this? Will my finances support me not being psychologically well to work while I am trying to study and learn a new language in a lot of the cases? So having a financial plan for your study permit application is super essential. So this is not just about the meeting the minimum requirements. I'm going a little bit beyond and off topic here, but I always find that this makes for a smooth student experience where the person can actually focus on their studies, and sure, they can still work part-time, but they're not stressed out. They're not being tempted to being non-compliant, because a lot of the times students end up working their 24 hours and then working cash some other time because they need to make more money because they didn't plan accordingly. Meeting the minimum financial requirements does not guarantee an approval, particularly if you're applying from a country with a weakened economy or a high study permit refusal rate. Those things are two separate things, and they're true. So before you apply for a study permit in your country, you could research refusal rate, blah, 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 put the country in there. And then you could also do some research on reasons for refusals of these study permits. There are certain countries that RCIC has already targeted as people from these countries will not study, they're just gonna go to work. Or people from these countries borrow money from the rich uncle and they don't actually have the money. Or people from these countries, from this country, tend to use fake documents. So they receive lots of applications every day in that place because the applications are processed in that local consulate or embassy. They see the same types of applications a lot. So they can spot the fraud. They can spot when the person doesn't actually have the financial capacity. So my advice is to, if you don't quite have the funds, perhaps wait a little bit, try to work a little bit longer, save some more, try to find another source of income, or even try to plan to come to Canada as a permanent resident rather than as a student, because sometimes it's cheaper to do a permanent residence planning in obtaining that rather than coming as a student. And this is true, and you will see it in the news. Many students struggle or are forced to abandon their studies because they underestimate the real costs or cannot continue paying for tuition and living expenses, even if they initially met the minimum fund requirements. So like I said, a lot of people will present the documents, it will pass, they'll be approved, and then you see it in the news, them saying, oh, I had to stop studying, or I couldn't pay for the costs anymore. And I always ask myself, well, how did this person meet the requirements to begin with? It could be that the requirements were too little, which is why they've increased it. But it could also be that the person didn't actually have those funds, or they just didn't plan financially. Emergencies happen, things happen. People fall on the ice and they break a leg, or they get depressed in the winter, or something happened, they got sick, they got cancer. I've seen all sorts of stories coming from actual students that are in Canada. So you have to make sure that you can cover every possible scenario, not every possible scenario because you can't account for everything, but you have a solid plan, and you have an emergency plan and a backup plan to have the best possible experience. So for the new postgraduate work permit requirements, and I've kind of put here two different moments in time. So we had some initial changes in November 2024. And then we had some more changes now, early July. So a postgraduate work permit is the permit that you obtain after you study, after you complete your studies from eligible programs. So not every program is eligible, and we're going to talk about it a little bit after. And the postgraduate work permit is essential for people to gather work experience, but also for people who have some intention of establishing themselves permanently in Canada. The postgraduate work permit sometimes is what makes or breaks. So you have to also do a little bit of planning on where do I want to go? So do I want to become a permanent resident, or am I just going to study in Canada because I really want to attend this program, this university, and then after I actually intend to go back home and work, so I don't really care for the postgraduate work permit? But if you care, if you need that time of experience in Canada to be able to qualify for permanent residence, or even for your own resume, because you want to be able to work for a Canadian, specific Canadian company, or be in a Canadian job market to then bring that experience back home, then your postgraduate work permit is essential. So, and you need, before you even apply for a program, you need to look into the details of this application to make sure that that program that you're applying for is eligible for a postgraduate work permit. So you have to meet the general eligibility requirements for a postgraduate work permit, and that means that you have to graduate from an eligible designated learning institution that was at least 8 months long, or 900 hours if that was in Quebec. You have to have maintained full-time status as a student in Canada during each semester of your study program. An exception can be made for the final semester. And trust me, I've seen unaware students who, unfortunately, because of their lack of financial planning, they were not aware of this rule, and then they said, you know what, I'm going to drop it to part-time so that it's less tuition for me or my family to pay for. And then when they applied for their postgraduate work permit, they had a huge surprise. They were not eligible, spent 4 years in Canada. Actually, this person I'm thinking of spent 6 years in Canada because they dropped their bachelor's to part-time for a certain amount of time because they couldn't pay for it. And so they were no longer eligible for a postgraduate work permit. You also have to apply for a postgraduate work permit within 180 days of confirmation that you completed your program of study. This is very important to keep in mind. And your study permit had to be valid at some point during the 180 days after you graduated and before you submitted your postgraduate work permit application. Before anything else, so like I said, you have to plan accordingly. So there is this page that I'm showing here on the right side. This is the DLI list, and you can search, you can put in the province that you're going to study and look for the school, and it's going to show a yes or no, or sometimes like there's more information, more details for you to look into. To make sure that your DLI, so the school that you're going to, is actually postgraduate work permit eligible. There were changes, right? In 2023 and 2024, there were changes to what schools were and weren't eligible. Here in Quebec, we have a huge mess because before August 2023, the private institutions were postgraduate work permit eligible. In Ontario, we also had the programs that were for example, somebody attended a private college, but it was tied to a public college, and the diploma actually came with the public college's name. That those people used to be able to apply for a postgraduate work permit, and we can no longer do that. So there have been lots of changes. So if you're applying for your study permit now, you should, before anything, make sure that your school and the program that you're applying for are both eligible for a postgraduate work permit if, like I said, your goal is to work in Canada after you graduate and potentially apply for permanent residence. So there is a cutoff there on November 1st. So starting November 1st, some eligibility requirements have changed. If you submitted your study permit before November 1st, and are applying for our postgraduate work permit on or after November 1st, you must also meet the language requirement. So nowadays, anybody who's applying for a postgraduate work permit, we have a language requirement. And if you submitted your study permit application on or after November 1st, there's also the study program required that apply to the situation, which we're going to look at in a minute. And it says some programs currently listed in this table may no longer be eligible for a postgraduate work permit if you apply for a study permit on or after November 1st. So there has been a lot of shifts. It's a mess. It's kind of a lot of moving parts. So you have to make sure that your school is eligible and the program is eligible, and that you're going to be able to meet the requirements. If you are applying for postgraduate work permit after November 1st, so the language requirement is as follows. If you're attending a university level diploma or degree, master's, etc., you have to have the equivalent of a CLB 7 in all language areas. And I emphasize the all language areas because I have seen people trying to apply because they had, say, a 7, a 6, a 7, and 8, and the overall was still 7, but they still had their postgraduate work permit refused. At the college level, it's a CLB 5 in all language areas. So any college, polytechnic, or non-university program, including the CEGEPs in Quebec. So that's a level 5. And you would be surprised how many students attend 2 or 3 years of college and at the end of it still cannot meet the CLB 5 language. So I have had some clients, unfortunately, who were not able to get their postgraduate permits because they could not secure CLB 5. So this is something you have to plan in advance. If you're in your last semester of school or even halfway through, the language test is valid for 2 years. So, way before you're ready to apply for postgraduate work permit, you should have your language test. Do not wait until the last minute. Do not wait until after you graduate to be able to get your language test, because if something goes wrong and you miss the 180-day deadline, remember there's a deadline, you will not be able to get your postgraduate work permit. So for applicants applying for a postgraduate work permit after November 1st, 2024, there is now field of study requirement. So I put here who doesn't need it because it's easier to understand who doesn't need it instead of who needs it. So if you don't need to meet the field of study requirement, just to clarify, what is the field of study? So you are attending you've been accepted at a certificate of business administration at so-and-so college. Your program will have a code regarding what field that applies to. So there will be a list, which I'm going to show you in a minute, of programs that are accepted and programs that are not accepted. So this is now very important, and this has to do with what fields of study, meaning what positions, what people that go into the job market are actually in high demand for what Canada considers high demand or important for the job market. So you don't need to meet the field of study requirement if one of the following applies to you. You submitted your postgraduate work permit before November 1st, regardless of the level of study. So everybody who's already submitted last year, they're good to go. You graduated from a postgraduate work permit eligible flight school. There are some little different rules regarding flight schools. I didn't go into detail here because that's a very small niche of students. But say you ever had a question about that, I can be available to answer that. You graduated with a bachelor's degree, master's degree, or a doctoral degree. So the degrees, you do not need to show a field of study. You applied for study permit before November 1st, 2024. At this point, anybody who's already in Canada studying would have fallen into this. So really, we're talking about the new applicants, right? If you don't meet one of the exceptions above, use the table below to check if your program is eligible for a postgraduate work permit. So we have a little table. Hang on. Where's my table? This is the table. Sorry, my slides are out of order. So if you look into the RCIC website, there will be a little table, and it shows right there, if you can see agriculture and agri-food. It shows the code, so CIP 0.006, etc., etc. So this is the current list of eligible CIP codes. And going back here, where to find this code? So the CIP code stands to Classification of Instructional Program Code, and where you can find this. So you can find this on your letter of acceptance, on the school's website, searching through the CIP list. So say you're going to study nursing and you type in nursing, you might have the title of the program. I found that the schools don't really have a rule across them. So some schools show it on the website, some don't. Some show on the letter of acceptance, some don't. So it's kind of tricky finding, this code. You could also ask the International Student Department before you apply. They will for sure have this information, even if it's not public on the website. And of course, you can kind of guess related to the topic. So if you type on that list, business administration, for example, you're not going to find it. But if you type nursing or anything related to trades, you're going to find it. But to be 100% sure, you can always ask the school before you apply, or even after you applied, but still hasn't accepted your entry in the school or paid any fees. So there were some updates to this list. So there were updates to this list first made on June 25th, where they removed several fields, then they were put back. And 119 new field of studies were added. There was a huge kerfuffle on the removal of the fields because there were people that say they had just applied for their study permit, or say they had just began their program studies. That kind of disrupts a lot of people's lives. So on July 4th, they actually put a note where they were putting back the fields that they had removed. I think it was 170 something. I forgot to add the number, but 179 fields, perhaps, something like that they had removed. And then they put back, and they said the list will actually stay like this for now until early 2026. So if you're applying for study permit in 2025, you can use this list. But if you're planning to apply in 2026, before you apply, go to this list and see if your program of study is still eligible for a postgraduate work permit. So steps to a successful plan as an international student, research the program of study. So first of all, is the DLI, so Designated Learning Institution, postgraduate work permit eligible? Is there a field of study requirement? What is the language requirement? So do I have sufficient level of French or English to attend a university? Even if I pass and I am admitted, we know there are some universities that will accept alternative testing, and that doesn't necessarily reflect, say, a CLB 7. So is this realistic for me? What will the necessary financial capacity? So this goes back to the funds required at the time of applying for study permit. And again, the funds, the same way that the list of schools change, the list of financial capacity can also change, right? They update it regularly nowadays. And is there a possibility that I would need to change schools? So if so, what are the requirements for the new program, and is it postgraduate work permit eligible? So you have to do this mental exercise again, because another rule that was changed last year is that if you change DLIs, you now have to apply for a new study permit. And as you saw, the date that you applied for the study permit limits what you can and you can't do. So if you are changing to another school and this new school is not postgraduate work permit eligible, then you're applying for a new study permit, you automatically kind of waste your program of studies if your plan was to obtain a postgraduate work permit. And what are your options, if any, for permanent residence after you graduate, if this is your goal? I didn't mention the length of the postgraduate work permit, so you have to keep in mind that in general, a 1-year program will give you a 1 year of postgraduate work permit. A program that is between 1 and 2 years will normally give you the length of that program. Say the program was 16 months or 17 months, it will give you that time in postgraduate work permit. And usually a program that is 2 years or more will give you a 3-year postgraduate work permit. So you have to keep the length of the program also in mind, not just if it's eligible, because that will affect your planning for permanent residence if that's where you're going, if that's what you intend. Here are the links to all this information that I posted. So these are lengthy links, but if you just put on Google, IRCC, study permit, IRCC, postgraduate work permit, IRCC, if you just do your Googling a little bit, this is all information that comes from the Canada.ca website. So eventually you will find these details. Any questions?
Thank you so very much, Marina, for a very comprehensive covering of what has changed for international students in relation to the new postgraduate work permit provisions and the new financial requirements for international students. I know it's not part of what you were briefing today, but I think it's also very topical for international students to realize that the federal government and its proposed legislation for building a stronger border is trying to place a limit on the ability to be able to apply for refugee status. Could you briefly make a comment about that?
So from what I've read, they have a plan, which is, I think it's not in effect yet.
Not in effect yet.
I haven't seen anything come by where you would be limited in time. So you would be limited in time. You would have a specific amount of time after you arrive in Canada to apply for asylum. And I believe they would also want to limit international students from applying, because what's happening right now with the scenario that we have, they have reduced the number of permanent residence applications because of their quotas. We have reduced the number of provincial nominees applications that can be done, provincial nominee certificates that can be issued per province. And since the pandemic, there has been, so there was at first there was let's shut down all the borders 100% because of the pandemic, and then there was a movement of let's open it up and let's facilitate people's entry because the job market needs people, and because we're in high demand in a lot of areas and we need to get the economy moving and things like that. And then they realized that we found ourselves with way too many temporary residents that we could actually absorb into permanent residents. And also resources like housing and health and social services and things like that. And because of that, a lot of international students who had done this enormous planning of, I'm going to Canada to study for 4 years, then have my postgraduate permit, work for 2 or 3 years, then apply for permanent residence, basically went down the drain. And unfortunately, the one solution that some people think is going to be the solution is to apply for asylum. So they have realized that this is breaking the system, right? So preventing international students from applying for seeking asylum without any merit would basically be the way that they think is going to counteract this move. And we're seeing a lot of people either applying for humanitarian compassionate considerations and or seeking asylum when they don't really have a merit to it, which is quite sad, kind of abusing of the system. It's unfortunate that a lot of people have found themselves in this position. I don't think it's fair either, but then again, it's also not fair to abuse of the system that, is just trying to reconfigure itself and protect itself. And yeah.
Because what we're also seeing with that same act is an increase in regards to being able to pause, put a pause on certain groups of applications,
Hmm.
to discontinue streams.
Hmm.
So that has been provided. And
Hmm.
also it becomes much more important because we do have cancellation of documents with certain uh, documents being canceled,
Hmm.
uh, temporary resident permits,
Hmm.
electronic
Yeah.
travel authorizations.
Yeah.
And if we have enforceable removal orders, which usually would deal with cases of failed asylum seekers, furthermore canceling their ability to remain, such as work permits and student permits within Canada to actually try to force a removal of them. But then we're also seeing a situation now where we've seen the CBSA not necessarily deporting or removing individuals from Canada, and we're seeing more, I'll say, posts in regards to the consequences or a demand for the CBSA to step up their enforcement uh,
Mhm.
actions as well.
Yeah. There have been lots of measures. I mean, a lot of, trying to cut at the knee measures where reducing LMIA length from 24 to 12 months, not allowing every single spouse to obtain an open work permit. That's kind of a self-deportation measure, because if a family that was here, say a family of four that was here because dad was studying and mom had an open work permit, and then he graduates, get his postgraduate work permit, but mom can no longer obtain an open work permit because there's also now a requirement of type of position that the person is occupying. It becomes financially not viable. So this family will end up self-deporting themselves, and just kind of, so there have been lots of these little measures, or even just the end of flag polling, or where you kind of force the person to apply from outside, so the person has to leave, and then if they're refused, they just can't come back. So lots of little measures, which I'm curious to see in the medium run, to see like how is this actually going to, what are we look right now, we're seeing a mess, it's a transition, there's a lot of panic. 9 out of 10 people I talk to, it's the same conversation, my fill in the blank is going to expire in X amount of time, what can I do to stay? To that I say, if you are planning to come to Canada right now as an international student or as a permanent resident or as a foreign worker, is there any way that you could qualify for permanent residence rather than coming as a temporary? Sometimes it's a longer detour. They have to either, okay, I have to increase my French, my English, I have to learn French, I have to go get a master's, I have to do this, I have to gather more funds, I have to, whatever it is. If at the end of your planning, you can actually land in Canada as a permanent resident, that is way better for you than to come as a student or as a worker, because we just never know. It's such uncertain times that, you could, once you land as a permanent resident, the officer at the border says, welcome home, you belong. But if you come as a temporary resident, it's just basically a big question mark at the end of the line.
With that note, I'd like to say thank you so very much, Marina, for today.